So the question would be now, do you think that the European Union still have its transformative power when it comes to the fundamental rights and freedoms?
I mean, the starting point for me would be to really question the role of the Council in the power structures of the European Union. While Europe was for long regarded as a union of nation states in which the leaders of these nation states somehow try to achieve compromises between their interests, the EU really requires a fundamental shift towards a European democracy. Why? Because the structure of power established by the Council is a structure that encourages nationalism rather than fights against it. Why? Because the leaders of the nation states inside of this power structure of the Council are not representing political values, ideas, concepts, different competing ideas about how to deal with public matters, services, interests, social developments, as it would be the right way for a democratic society where not ethnic parties, but parties of different ideas should compete with each other for the vote of the people. And what we now have is that on the plane of the European Council, the leaders represent national interests, which means that this system in one way privileges those who express nationalism as a tool of national interests. So this system is working against itself. And as long as we don't have a parliament in which parties that represent various competing concepts of politics rather than national and even ethnic interests, we can't move forward to a democratic decision-making in Europe. And this has a lot of impact on the way European societies inside of themselves deal with the question of majority and minority, with the question whether, if democratic decision-making is just a tool of majorities, or it's a tool to protect the rights of diversity and minorities. And nobody should forget, everybody is belonging to minorities, not only to majorities, and needs this protection at certain moments in life and political development.
The conference now, which is also the basis for this whole project, the Conference on the Future of Europe, also tries to have a little bit of a bottom-up approach on how to reform the European Union in the years to come. And the idea is also to include civil society and youth. So my question is, what role can civil society and youth, but also especially cultural institutions, since you are the director of the Jewish Museum in Hohenems in Vorarlberg, and also cultural institutions, what role can they play in this process? Is it important that they are included?
I mean, the civil society at large and cultural institutions in particular have the chance to create communication that is crossing the concepts of identity, the concepts of exclusive models of culture, which is something that is a rather new idea for cultural institutions. We just have to know that museums were established mainly in the large number in the 19th century to foster national identities, or later on also regional identities in an essentialist way. That means in a way that it's exclusive and not inclusive. And it's a rather new idea that cultural institutions are about exchange, international collaboration, questioning models of identities rather than stabilizing them or even militarizing them. Now we have a kind of rollback in Europe, in many countries, where political forces try to redefine museums as creators of national identity. We have that most prominently in countries like Poland, Hungary, and others, but we also have these debates in Western European states. So we have these debates around the role of Jewish museums in Germany, where the sheer fact that the Jewish Museum of Berlin, for instance, created an open space for debate between Jews and Muslims in the academy of the museum, which was one of the most prominent places where there was a kind of eye-level communication between Muslims and Jews, produced a lot of anger in the conservative, identity-concerned media like the FAZ, or also in right-wing Jewish parts of the communities, among Israel fanatics that couldn't stand that particularly a Jewish museum was engaging itself in an open dialogue with European Islam, trying to build bridges and to open spaces for also a redefinition of Europe as not a Christian and not a Christian Jewish whatever cultural entity. I mean, the latter one, Christian Jewish, is just a formula to not open this space for Islam and Muslims, and is more a political slogan rather than any kind of reality. But we all have these kind of little battles in the field of culture, how to define culture, how to make it either inclusive or exclusive. And this is an ongoing debate. I mean, there's an ongoing debate in the ICOM, in the International Council of Museums, where a new definition of museums as democratic institutions was proposed by a large number of museums and rejected by an even larger number of museums on the international, in this case, not only European, but global plane. And so this is an ongoing debate between activists in cultural fields and a more conservative spectrum that is rather regarding culture as something that closes societies rather than opening them.
Also, maybe in this context, when we come back to the European Union, it is very often portrayed not only within but also abroad as a union of values. How do you see the credibility of the European Union now when it comes to fundamental values, human rights, democratization, individual freedoms, and what reforms, what actions should be done to regain trust in European institutions?
Values, I mean, there's a lot of talk about European values, and values for me is a pretty ambivalent wording, because it's very in the way people think of values, it's very much connected with cultural tradition. So in Austria, if you discuss values in Austria, there are quite a number of people who think the right to eat schnitzel is a value, or the right to not allowing Muslim women to wear a headscarf is a value. So I'm not very inclined to use the word value. What we need, or what I rather would propose, is to discuss rules. And the interesting thing is that when particularly after World War I and during World War II and after World War II, when people really thought about creating a European Union, and when they started to talk about how to protect rights, human rights, minority rights, how to protect people from being suppressed by powers or even killed by national mobs. When these people started to think about how a European Union could be established that could function to protect the life of people in their diversity, their right to decide upon themselves, about themselves, their way of living, the decision whom to marry, where to live, how to go, where. And many of the people who did that, I mean, many of those people who started to think about the European Union were Jews who reflected their own experience in World War I, and naturally it reflected their experience in the Shoah. They were not talking about European values. They were talking about European laws. They were talking about how to establish courts who could protect the rights of people and who could protect the rules that are necessary for different people to live together with shared understanding of what is allowed to do and what is not allowed to do, of what is a right of people and what is not a right of people. And they were pretty successful, at least in finding formulas for that. I mean, laws, international laws, declarations of civil rights, of human rights, establishing courts that could protect that. They were not that much successful in reality if you look at what these laws could really help people, and they are also not that successful as we would wish it, how that courts, the European courts, the international courts, the Den Haag court, could really protect these rules. But at least they are in the world. And the energy with which we see people now try to ridicule the international law, the human rights, the courts, of the justice system that protects these rights, shows that it has some kind of impact. And everything the EU could do is to strengthen these institutions and not just to talk about value and culture and all these words.
Another question, because one of the other main pillars, which is also one of these very vague words, is solidarity, which is also part of the European Union, this solidarity approach. And we can see, especially right now, how important it is. And I think even the European Union managed at some point to show a little bit of solidarity, which was not seen before when it comes now to the pandemic, for example, so that we were able at least to agree at some point on how we proceed together. So the question would be now, how do you see solidarity within the European Union? But also, I mean, it's Europe is bigger than the European Union, and we also have like all these international threats. We have this international, we have the pandemic, climate change, international terrorism, cyber crime, etc. So how important do you see solidarity, and do you think it can be strengthened? And what role does the European Union essentially have when it comes to this solidarity approach?
I mean, solidarity requires some kind of joint decision-making that is not structured along particularist interests, which refers back to the question, how we could change the balance of power between council, parliament, and commission. At least the commission is somehow in between these two, parliament and council, and is rather concerned in common interests than if you look into the debates in the council. But the pandemic is a very good example where we see that in spite of all the bad talking about the EU with respect to vaccines, etc., I would still claim that if we wouldn't have this joint decision making, represented by the Commission, mainly in this case, buying, acquiring these vaccines in a joint way and trying to distribute the vaccines in a way of solidarity between the member states. I would rather say that this is a good example that it works, because what we would have if we wouldn't have that structure is competition between states that start to steal the vaccines from each other. And I mean, one of the sad examples, sad because it's acclaimed so much, is Israel. I mean, Israel is very successful, but the price for being successful is, first of all, that they really went to the nerves of the head of Pfizer. I mean, Netanyahu claimed to have called the Pfizer boss every night. So just imagine what would have happened if every leader of a state would call the head of Pfizer during night every day. I mean, the man couldn't sleep, and we would have no vaccines at all, because he wouldn't be able to run his business. I mean, so Israel is the worst example. I mean, they made it, but on the cost of everybody else. So if we would have that multiplied by, I don't know how many member states in the EU, if everybody would do that, we would simply have no vaccines today. And we just saw what happened if one chancellor, in this case the Austrian chancellor, is trying to look for his fortune inside in internal politics by accusing the EU of made up things, the fantasies he had about the bazaar in the EU. And the only problem was that his own representative not took all chances to order vaccines. And we even don't know if that would have helped Austria to get one shot more, because to order vaccines today doesn't mean that you get delivery, as we know. You can order a lot, but you get what is produced. And Mr. Kurz, the Austrian chancellor, really tried to break the solidarity system, not really in the interest of the Austrian public, but in the interest of his own survival as a politician. And we would have that multiplied by 20, 30 different states in the EU. And I just don't want to imagine what would have happened if the Commission would not be able to at least define some rules, how to deliver these things on an equal base to the different states.
What is your hope, or what would be your wish for the European Union, how it should be developing itself in the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years when it comes to the question about human rights and values and individual, but also collective freedoms?
I mean, there's one very pathetic thing that everybody always says, our hope is the youth. There's some truth about it, because young people are, I think, much more inclined to fight for their Europeanness than other generations, because they simply grew up in a Europe that is not primarily defined by borders anymore, but by some kind of exchange and border crossing, rather than borders that just put you in a kind of a cage. And the second thing is that we see for quite a while that the deputies to the European Parliament are much more courageous to stand up and to be active, to define projects, to make use of the little power they have, which is the budget, but also the power that they simply have by speaking out loudly what could be a development for the EU and what should not. And I simply have the hope that this courage of the members of the European Parliament could also change the climate step by step. And I'm not very optimistic that these things are on a fast track, but there is movement. And yeah, and then there is the Brussels bureaucracy, which is also something people are mostly making jokes about. But if you look how they work, 90% of what they do is much more intelligent than everything that happens in the national parliaments of the member states. So I also have some hope in the kind of swarm intelligence of those people who are simply active on the European plane, that this somehow will trickle down into the societies in which they still live.